everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. Our topic for tonight is the progressive give up formula strikes again. I'm joined by the co host of Around the World with Brandy and Dee, my good friend, Dee Pierce.
Yes, thank you for having me, Joe. I'm glad to be here.
My pleasure, Dee. My pleasure. So, uh, when I saw this interview that we're going to talk about today, uh, okay, I really did a double take on it. And the reason why I did a double take on it, or at least the first part of it, let's say the first 45 minutes of the interview, was because it seemed as though neither Rick Wolf nor Brejoy Gray had ever heard of MMT. It just seemed like they were locked into the old frame that has represented what I call the progressive give up formula. In fact, I've written a book about the progressive give up formula. It's called Real Fiscal Responsibility, the progressive give up formula, or Real Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 1, I should say, the progressive give up formula, which is all about what they're talking about here. But anyway, oh, and by the way, I put a link to the book in the description. I put a link to my other book on fixing the debt, okay, in the description. I put a link to Stephanie Kelton's book in the description. And I think there's something else I put in the description too. Oh, I know, a link to the YouTube itself. Okay, so let me start. Okay, what I'll do is I will start to play the YouTube and then stop it at certain points, okay, as soon as I can. So we'll be starting a YouTube and stopping and starting and stopping and starting and stopping, because all the different pronouncements of either Brejoy Gray or Rick Wolf, of course, occur at different times during their interview. So I have all these times listed, and I'll kind of stop things at the right times. I hope. I hope this works out smoothly and is not too choppy, but I can't really guarantee that because I am rather ham handed, as you will probably see. But anyway, here is, I am sharing the entire, try sharing the entire screen here for you. And I will start to play this. Let's see first whether we've successfully gotten it on the screen. Yes, we have. And so here's the start, okay, of the interview. Uh, okay, the first stopping point is at 1:30.
I'm so glad to be joined again on Bad Faith Podcast by Professor Richard Wolff, an American Marxist economist known for his work on economic methodology and class. And is why are we spending more than we are able to pay? Why do we keep ending up in this situation?
Okay, we're at 1:30 now.
What are the best solutions to prevent this discourse from coming around periodically? So first and foremost,
okay, that's the discourse about the debt ceiling crisis. Okay, because this whole stream is about possible solutions to the debt ceiling crisis. I personally don't think they arrived at any, but here we go.
Why is there a concern around the debt cliff upcoming?
Okay, you're absolutely right. I give lots of talks around the country. I get this question now all the time. So it needs a few little definitions so we're all kind of on the same page here. Governments have to spend money. The American government, our government, spends money on defense. It spends money on roads and bridges. It spends money on social security checks. It has all this spending to do. Some of it is for the benefit of corporations and rich people. Some of it is for the benefit of the general public. Both the public and the corporations and the rich, they want those services from the government because they're crucial. You know, we can't be exporting around the world if we are not militarily making sure that nobody else is out competing us or blocking us. So the government takes care of that. You know, we're the only government in the world that maintains hundreds of military bases around the world. And that's one of the reasons we have the position we do. And similarly, we operate a pension system. If you're over 67 years of age, you get a pension that you've been putting money into, but the government is responsible for giving you that money, and it uses a pay-as-you-go system. So the money coming in is what is used to pay out, and all the other things that the government does.
Okay, so from an MMT point of view, uh, what Rick says, okay, implies that the tax revenue that comes in pays for what goes out. This is in direct contradiction to MMT, which says, of course, that taxes do not pay for anything, that what pays for things in that sense is the appropriations of Congress and the Treasury spending money into the economy. Those are the two things that pay for things. The Federal Reserve has an intermediate role. It settles the tax deposit transactions, and in the process of settlement, it destroys the old revenue and creates entirely new revenue in equal measure, using the authority that the Fed has gotten from the Congress under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and the Federal Reserve Act, which gives the authority to the Federal Reserve to top up the Treasury spending account. In other words, to add reserves to the Treasury spending account. So it's not the revenue that is paying for anything in the sense of the taxes that come in or the revenue from the sale of Treasury debt. So that's the first problem. So let me go a little further now.
Normally, governments raise the money to pay for all the services by taxing. They tax.
So there he's saying that the government raises the money to pay for things by taxing. So he makes that
Tax
explicit.
corporations, they tax the rich, and they tax all of us. All right. The only problem is that politicians in our crazy economic system, our capitalism, are in an impossible situation because the corporations and the rich on the one hand, and all the rest of us on the other, we want all the services, but we don't want to pay taxes.
Okay, so that's certainly true. Okay, and it's not a problem. But okay, it also doesn't correctly characterize what is going on with public financing in that particular situation. So let's go a little further. Uh, or have I already gone too far? Okay, I've already gone a little further than I wanted to, but that's okay. That's not a problem. I'm going to go to the next stopping point now. I will skip now to 4 minutes and 18 seconds. That's close enough.
Excellent. But how do you do that? Where are you going to get the money to pay for the services? You know, the millions of people who work in the Social Security system or who operate the defense equipment or who fill in the blank. So, what the politicians have done, because our politicians are not, I'm being polite now, not noted for their courage, and with a few examples that are obviously exceptions, but what they've done is solve the problem in the lack of a courageous way by borrowing the difference.
So, in his view, the borrowing of the difference raises revenue that the Treasury Department then spends into the economy. And of course, he misses the whole step of Federal Reserve settlement of the revenue deposit and creation of entirely new money from the Federal Reserve.
It really is no different if you started spending like crazy. Suppose you decided that clothes are very.
Okay, so now he's going into a spending example. He's about to compare the government to a household and to say to Bree, well, if you were going into a store and you were buying some clothes and you had preferences and you went a little crazy with clothes buying, that's somehow analogous to the government's going a little crazy with the stuff, okay, that it buys. Of course, the analogy there is very weak. It might seem similar in some cases, but it doesn't take account of the fact that the federal government can and does create its own money all the time. And neither Rick nor myself nor Bree has that capability. So let us go a little further. Let me find out where I must go. Okay, so jumping now to approximately 5 minutes and 30 seconds, 37 seconds. Let's get to 5 minutes and 32
Same thing.
seconds.
It borrows. And it's been doing that like there's no tomorrow. Why? Well, because we are like my example of you, and don't take it personally, but if you spend too much and you don't get
All my
enough,
shopping is on my debit card, Professor Wolf.
there we go. That's right. That's a safer way to go. The government should do that system too. It doesn't. So
The government should do that system too. Okay, so what he's saying is the government, I mean, I think what he's saying, what he may not know what he's saying, but what he seems to be saying is that the government should spend into the economy what it has in the Treasury spending account. I have a little news for him. That is what the government actually does. It does not spend money into the economy until it has the money in the Treasury spending account. The issue here is how that money can get into the Treasury spending account and what are the various ways of putting it into the Treasury spending account. Now, Rick Wolf thinks it comes into the Treasury spending account because it's tax revenue collected by the government. Okay, and that is not what happens, as I earlier explained. Okay, the revenues are deposited by the Treasury Department again, deposited into the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve does the transaction. In the process of the transaction, the revenues that were collected and that were originally created by the federal government come home, are redeemed during the settlement, which means those revenues are zeroed out, and the Fed has to create new reserves in equal amount for the Treasury Department to spend. I did want to clarify what was really going on there. So, going back, let me get a few more seconds here.
Give you an example. Back in 1982, we had about $4 trillion worth of federal government debt. Today, it's around $32 trillion. That's grown faster than anything, way faster than our economy's wealth. It's like you spending way ahead of what you're in, even if your income is going up.
Here, he's confused the economy's income with the economy's wealth. Even if you accept that GDP is a proper measure, and there are all kinds of questions about that, GDP is the income of a nation over a 1-year period. That's not the wealth of the nation. It's not the total sum of the assets of the nation. For example, right now, our total debt is up to something like close to $31 trillion, $30.5 trillion, I believe it was a few days ago when I looked. Okay, so that's the total debt. The GDP of the nation at that time was something like $23.5 trillion or something like that. So the national income is $23.5 trillion. Of course, that's less than the total debt. But when you're using an individual's balance sheet or a corporation's balance sheet, okay, the income and the assets are not the same. The value of the assets, okay, is much different. Now, if we're talking about the value of our national assets, and if we're asking what that value is, it might be $120 trillion or $150 trillion, depending upon how things are evaluated. Now, there's one other problem with this. The United States is a monetary sovereign, which gives it the capability to create an unlimited amount of dollars at will by using the authority rendered in Article 1, Section 8, okay, of the Constitution. What is that capability of the federal government worth as an asset? What asset value can we place on that? I don't even think Rick Wolff or Brejoy Gray has begun to think about that. Generally, when organizations like, let's say, Credit Suisse or some other financial organizations, they might estimate the worth of assets here in the United States as what, $130 trillion, $120 trillion? Okay. In other words, the assets are a pretty high multiple set against the debt, and an even higher multiple set against the annual income. So Rick is confusing the wealth of the United States with its national income. And he's also confusing the asset value of the United States, or the wealth of the United States, with its debt, thinking that the debt of the United States exceeds its assets. That is not true, and it's especially not true if we take into account the value of the capability to create as much money as the government wants to create for whatever purpose it deems appropriate. Okay, I'm sure Rick Wolf and I could argue about that. There are arguments against what I just said, but they're not the kinds of arguments that Rick is giving here. Okay, anyway, I guess I'll continue to go forward at this
Up.
point.
You're spending so fast that your debts are going up much faster. That's the truth of our situation here in the United States. But there's no mystery why. It's because we put our politicians in this you can't win situation. You have to give the services, you can't raise the taxes, so you end up borrowing, and the borrowing has gone crazy.
So he's made an assumption here, since he was talking in terms of GDP and not in terms, okay, of assets, that our debt is growing much faster than our national income, okay, is growing. And so we can't afford to pay the debts as they fall due. However, the debts are paid for by American dollars. They are fixed over a period of time. There are the interest rates, but the interest rates on debt instruments we've already sold are fixed. They do not change. The principal on the debt does not change. The government has the capability to pay back any debt with interest because it has the capability to create US dollars at will. So therefore, even if the debt in US dollars is rising much faster than the national income, okay, is rising, that has no implications for whether we can pay back the debt. Absolutely none. What's relevant is whether we have the capability to pay back the debt by creating enough money to pay back the debt, because the debt is in dollars. And of course, as I've said now multiple times in different ways, we can pay back any debt when it falls due. And in fact, we do pay back any debt when it falls due, other than debts that are due at the point of the debt ceiling. But still, we do not default in connection with the debt ceiling. We don't have formal defaults, which is failure to pay back the debt, failure to pay back each debt instrument when the due date comes. We have always found ways to do that. It doesn't matter how fast our debt is increasing. It doesn't matter how high the debt instruments are in terms of their principal value. We can always come up with the necessary money by using the currency creation power of the United States. Going for
Now, the borrowing gets even worse if you reduce your taxes. Donald Trump, in December of 2017, passed the biggest tax.
He's right about that. Okay, it does. It doesn't actually create a problem, but it does mean that the debt might be paid back more. Well, I'm sorry, I myself am getting confused by his terminology here. it doesn't matter how fast the debt actually grows, the tax cuts do not affect that. What they do is they give us a bigger deficit, but the deficit has nothing to do whether we can pay back the debts that are falling due. Because again, we always have the capacity to create, okay, our own money if we want to create, okay, our own money. And we can always pay the debts because what we do is we roll the debt. That is, we borrow the money to pay the current debt that is falling due. And we borrow the money as well to pay the debt that was just sold when it does fall due at some time in the future. Our capacity to borrow the money is only constrained by the debt ceiling. So if we always find a way to get around the debt ceiling, there's no problem in paying back the debt. So
cut imaginable. One of the biggest in our country's history, mainly for corporations and the rich. And everybody was all excited, particularly the Republicans. Oh, isn't this wonderful? The corporations are going to have more money to spend in this. It's as if you had gone to that clothing store and said, oh, this is a nice sweater and that's a beautiful shirt and blah, blah, blah. And so suddenly you realize this is going to make the government in a deeper hole because a huge amount of taxes, hundreds of billions of dollars every year are not coming in now that we didn't cut our spending. So we're in trouble. So if you suddenly cut taxes, you're going to make this borrowing problem worse.
okay, so again, I pointed out that the borrowing problem is not a problem from the standpoint of the ability to repay. No matter how high the debt is, no matter how fast it increases, the ability to repay always remains the same. Why doesn't he think that it remains the same? Why does he think that it may become unsustainable the faster the debt grows? And the reason for that is that he neglects to think about the government's power to create the money to repay any debt. Why does he fail to think about it? Because we have never used that power to repay any debt before. What we do is we wait for the debt ceiling to be raised, and then we just go ahead and borrow the money again. Okay, I know there are technical arguments that state that the government is really not borrowing money, not in the same sense as you and I borrow money. But what those arguments come down to is that the government's debt is not really the same kind of debt that we have, because the government is a monetary sovereign and has the unlimited power to create its own money to repay the debts. So that's why there's a famous slogan in MMT that government debt is not a debt. And that slogan is based on that idea that the government has the power to create the money, but we don't have the power to create that money. So our debt is real debt, and the government debt, therefore, somehow is not actually debt. I don't actually subscribe to that. If you look at the individual level of what's going on, the government is selling debt instruments the same way a bank sells a certificate of deposit. We give our money to the government by buying Treasury securities. The Federal Reserve destroys that money in settlement, and creates new money for the Treasury Department to use. But from the standpoint of the person that's buying the debt instrument, that person is making a loan to the federal government, and repayment of that loan is due on a particular date, just like a CD is due on a particular date. So the principal repayment on the loan is due on a particular date, and the interest payments are also due on particular dates. So to the person buying the Treasury security, it looks to them like they're lending the federal government some money for a particular period of time, and they are getting repaid on that loan with interest. So, whether it's really a debt or not depends on your perspective. Looked at from the individual point of view, this is a debt of the government, and the government always pays its debts. In fact, it is mandated to pay its debts by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, Section 4 of the Constitution.
Here's another thing that people have been doing this last year that makes it worse. If you suddenly start spending more, again, use the example, you go back to that lovely store and you indulge a few more of your clothing preferences.
It's a
Well,
story.
we have a big new expenditure this last year. It's called the Ukraine war.
Hmm.
We have committed as a nation over $100 billion, much of it already spent. That's a whole new expenditure of enormous size. It is, to be blunt, very, very much worsening our deficit, our
Mm.
gap between what the government spends and what it takes in. So you put the two things together, Ukraine in 22, tax cut in 17, and you've got a 1-2 whammy that's making the borrowing go nuts because you've cut your taxes and you're spending more. Okay, so now what happens? The spending goes up and up, and everybody understands somewhere that these debts are going to have to be repaid. When the government borrows, it has to pay back.
Right. And of course, I just said, I entirely agree with that. If the government borrows, if it sells debt instruments, it must repay the principal of those debt instruments on a date certain at some future time. There's no argument about that. And Rick is right. The government will have to pay that back at some time, okay, in the future. Okay. But again, he's not considering the power of the government to create whatever money it needs to do something, including repay
The
debt.
people it borrows from. So we're accumulating a debt. Our underlying economy isn't getting bigger as much as the debt is getting bigger, and that's not a sustainable situation. So the government is full of criticism. Oh, we got to stop. We got to stop.
Okay. Our economy may not be growing as rapidly as the debt, okay, is growing. But for a monetary sovereign, that is not an unsustainable situation, because the debt and the interest on the debt get repaid in terms of money, not in terms of real attributes of the economy. That may be unfortunate for the government's creditors, but that is the truth. In taking the government's bonds, the creditors were contracting to get themselves paid back in dollars, whatever the value of those dollars are at some future time, is not the concern of the government. If the dollar is worth less at some future time, then those treasury securities will have proven to be a bad investment for the people who bought them. And that's just going to be too bad. But the ability of the federal government to repay the debt on the terms that were contracted remains unimpaired. The situation is not unsustainable from a financial point of view. Now, it may be unsustainable from a political point of view, because, of course, if we have a protracted inflationary period where treasury instruments are getting devalued over a period of time, then the treasury instruments would lose their legitimacy and people would stop actually buying the treasury instruments. But even this would not be fatal for the government, because in order to pay back any previous debts contracted by the federal government, once again, the creation of money can always pay those debts back. Until the government actually loses political legitimacy, the government is not in trouble from the fact that the money is being devalued over time. In other words, the situation has to get so bad that the political legitimacy of the government, is strengthened. Is increased. Is decreased, so that there's an actual threat, of overthrow of the government. So let's go a little further.
So some years ago, again, our courageous lack of politicians decided, let's show America how concerned we are. And here's what they did. They passed a law, that's all it is, that we have a ceiling. We have an amount of money, more than we now owe, that we can't go beyond. It's a ceiling. You can't go above it. That's all it means. And it's thus and so. All right. Everybody who follows this knew at the time that given the way this country works, if you don't, this is important in terms of corporations and the rich, because they have demonstrated over the last 40 years the ability to evade taxes legally, illegally. It's all over the place. Everybody knows this. And corporations don't want to do anything because they depend on the donations from those same companies to be in political office. So we're not going to touch it. And that makes the rich and the corporations smile. And I'm going to explain now why they're smiling. When the government doesn't raise the taxes on them, and therefore doesn't have enough money to pay for all the services, it borrows. But here comes the kicker. Who does it borrow from? Answer: from the corporations and the rich. Nobody else is around to borrow from. The mass of the American people don't have extra money to lend to the government. How many times have you sat down, you or people like me and you, with a government representative discussing how much we're going to help lend to the government? Doesn't happen. And here's what it is. We're going to raise the ceiling again.
Okay, so Rick was in the process of making the point, just earlier, that, this is wonderful for the wealthy people or the corporations or the institutions that are buying the debt, because not only do they not have to pay taxes because the government gave them a tax reduction, but in order to keep the money flowing, the government goes to them to buy the debt that they believe then is needed to create the revenue for the government. And when they buy that debt, they get a safe investment, and they also get the repayment of principal. and interest as specified in the bond. Okay. So that's a very good point on his part. They're getting the tax reduction, which is really terrific, and they're getting the profits from the Treasury instrument, which is also really terrific, and they are laughing all the way to the bank. So let's go on.
They've done it repeatedly. We're going to kick the can down the road, literally, and we'll make a little adjustment on the spending and a little adjustment on the taxes. Mr. McCarthy will look good for the Republicans. Mr. Biden will look good for the Democrats. And absolutely nothing changes, except we're supposed to take this theater seriously the next time it repeats its boring, unfair story. And those same corporations and the rich smile all the way to the bank, which they own.
Professor Wolf, that's such a cogent description of what's going on here. And I can't help but recognize that such a different narrative than the one that is painted by even, I think, liberal journalists who are sympathetic to kind of the left perspective on this. The part of the framing that you've included here, which is that it's debts that are incurred in part because the rich aren't sufficiently taxed. Now, the rich are then able to basically profiteer from this system by, I guess, lending the government money by, I presume, buying treasury bonds. Or is that the mechanism by which?
That's exactly how it's done. That's right.
And so they're getting it. They're winning on the front end and the back end is incredibly compelling. And
so that's certainly the point, okay, and it's a good point, but it doesn't address the question of the financial sustainability of what is going on from the viewpoint of the government. From the viewpoint of the government, that pattern may be profligate. It may be giving unwarranted profits to the rich and to the corporations. But from a financial stabilization point of view, a financial sustainability point of view, it doesn't make a bit of difference.
So I guess I want to start by asking, why is it the case that those government bonds are considered to be such a good bet, given that we have been in this cycle of basically continuing to borrow without repaying for so long?
Well, the answer I'm going to give you is going to upset some folks, but we're not here to, if you don't want to be upset, watch the evening news on the mainstream media. They will put you to sleep in all the ways. Here's the problem. You are pointing to something which is even more taboo to talk about in our culture than the stuff I just went through in terms of the hustle that our national debt is. And here's the thing. The people around the world, and by people I really mean the governments, the central bankers, the people who follow this kind of stuff, they've noticed exactly what you've noticed. They've noticed that the debts of the United States have been going up very fast. They noticed that the debts have been going up way faster than the underlying economic growth, which is in the end how you're going to pay off these debts. And so, in fact, they have decided to be less in the business of buying U.S. Treasury. They're not going to lend money because it's
okay. The reason why the people who buy Treasury debt still do buy Treasury debt, and by the way, there's no indication from the auctions that people are hesitating to buy Treasury debt. What Rick is about to say is that some nations are divesting themselves, okay, of Treasury debt, but there's no indication as yet that other nations are not coming to the table to buy Treasury debt, or that corporations or rich individuals, okay, are hesitating to come to the table to buy Treasury debt. Uh, and Rick here misses a very important point as to why people buy Treasury debt in explaining the reason why to Bree. And that reason is the simple point that the Treasury debt instruments are guaranteed to be repaid by the 14th Amendment when that is coupled with the fact that the United States is a monetary sovereign and can always create the money to repay the debt. The business world knows this. It knows the government of the United States is not able to default, and it doubts, therefore, that it will ever voluntarily default, because it cannot voluntarily default. So he doesn't mention that to Bree, and she never hears that reason.
It's becoming risky in a way that it hasn't been for a century. Another way of saying this, which is going to upset people, but it's the truth, is that the century from roughly the First World War to roughly now, about 100 years, is a period of time, most of which the American economy was going up. It was getting stronger, it was getting richer. Not for everybody. White people is what I'm talking about. Everybody knows that, or should. They were doing really pretty well. I mean, the profits were going up, the real wages, in other words, what you could afford to buy, the American standard of living for working people was the envy of the world. That was all true. But it stopped being true around the 70s or 80s, 40 years ago. The only reason we didn't have a national discussion about it was that we had a drug, an economic drug, to take us through the last 30 years, allow our standard of living to keep growing, even though our wages stopped. That drug is called credit. And we have been living on credit, the government credit, that's what we've been talking about. But we are at record levels of corporate credit. We are at record levels of household credit. We are an economy that is living on borrowed time, the borrowing being literally the credit. It crashed in 2008 and 9, which is why the whole economy almost disintegrated. And we're not out of the woods because the same problems are not being resolved. Let me give you an example. The United States is the greatest debtor country in the world. All of this borrowing means that the United States owes to the rest of the world more money than any other country on the planet. We've been borrowing so much. Okay, who are the biggest creditors? Who's lending to us besides ourselves? The American people, corporations, and the rich. But other countries, the biggest creditor are two countries. They're going back and forth. Which is number one? Which is number two? One of them is the People's Republic of China, and the other one is Japan. The two of them are the major lenders to the United States. By the way, think what it means if Americans really understood what I just said, that the biggest debtor in the world is the US, and the biggest creditor, or maybe number two, is the People's Republic of China. Who's in the driver's seat here? Who's doing well?
Okay. So you hear this objection a lot, or this story a lot, that because our number one creditor is China, okay, or maybe Japan, we are somehow beholden to them and can be influenced or controlled by the fact that they own, I think in this case it's 1.3 trillion or 1.4 trillion, okay, of Treasury debt. How are they going to exert any meaningful leverage on what we do because they own that? Now, Rick's assuming the ownership gives them certain capabilities to give us some difficulties. But this debt that China holds is not something with a variable interest rate. It's not even one single debt. It's the sum of many debt instruments that were sold to China, to Chinese people, to Chinese companies, okay, and so on. Where is the debt account? Where is the debt account held? I'll tell you, the debt account is held at the Federal Reserve. At the Federal Reserve Bank, our central bank. When the debt is repaid as it falls due, all these little debts are repaid as they fall due. Okay, and the creditor company is not in a position to call the debts at any time. They're not like a credit card company. They have contracted to provide some dollars in return for a promise to repay on some particular date at the interest rate that was contracted for. That gives the creditor country no control at all over the debtor country, in this case, the United States. The implied influence comes from the idea, well, what if China quit buying debt? What if they suddenly quit buying our debt? We would still have to pay them, right? Yes, we would have to pay them. We'd have to create the money to pay them. But that's not really ever a problem. So what happens if they stop actually buying debt, so there's no rolling over of the Chinese debt over time? It's just going down and down and down further with the passage of time. That would only be important to the United States if there were not others interested in buying new treasury debt, and also if we were interested to keep on issuing debt. What Rick Wolff never considers, or Bree either, is that we could decide not to issue any more treasury debt. What if we minted the $100 trillion coin and stopped issuing debt instruments entirely? We would go ahead and out of the proceeds from the $100 trillion coin, we would repay all the debt as mandated by the 14th Amendment when that debt falls due. The Chinese would have absolutely no influence over that. The Japanese would have absolutely no influence over that. The Arab nations with their oil would not have any influence over that. Why is it so hard for Rick Wolff to understand, and for Bree to understand, that when you're a monetary sovereign who can create your own money, then the sale of debt instruments is purely voluntary on your part? What is so hard to understand about that? I submit to all of you that that's not really hard to understand. It's just that neither of them wanted to invest the time to read any decent amount of the MMT literature to come to understand what the implications of being a monetary sovereign are. They really don't understand it. Now, these issues of monetary sovereignty have risen over the last 20 years or so. By 2010 and 2011, they were pretty plain. It was pretty plain that from a theoretical point of view, a monetary sovereign was a different creature from a country whose currency was pegged to some external standard. And that understanding among many people has deepened since 2011. It's now 2023. MMT has been around for a long time. It's been prominent now since 2015. Was it 2015 or 2014, when Bernie Sanders first appointed Stephanie Kelton as his chief economist for the budget committee, of the Senate. Stephanie was running around Washington teaching people MMT during that period of time. In 2020, Bree was Bernie's press secretary. Stephanie Kelton was working as his chief economist on the campaign. Yet she never bothered to absorb the basics of MMT. Rick Wolf was one of the people on the economic dream team of Bernie Sanders that was established in, if I recall, 2012 or maybe 2013, I forget. So Rick was one of the people on that dream team, as was Jeffrey Sachs, as were a number of other people, including 4 people who understood the implications of monetary sovereignty very well: Bill Black, Randy Wray, Stephanie Kelton, and Jamie Galbraith. Those were all clearly understood. That was clearly understood by those people. How come the idea of monetary sovereignty never filtered through to either Bree or Rick Wolf? Why was that? Okay, I have no idea. So I want to start to come to the end of this by pointing out that the same problem recurs in all these comments by Rick Wolf, and it goes on through at least another 7 minutes of this video. I had some more instances to go through, but I'm not going to bother to do them because the point, is already made. It doesn't change. It's the same point. If you're going to do a cogent analysis, a compelling analysis, to use Bree's words, you have to think about these problems of increasing debt in terms of the capability of a monetary sovereign to increase the debt whenever the monetary sovereign cares to begin to do so. And neither of them are thinking at it in those terms. So they are giving an account that says there is this enormous problem here. It is the debt. We're going to have to pay it back someday. It's going to be a burden on our children and grandchildren and maybe ourselves, because the only way to pay it back is through taxation. We have to tax. We have to run surpluses. And of course, according to the sectoral financial balances aspect of MMT economics, if we run surpluses, we withdraw liquidity. We withdraw money from the private sector. And if we withdraw money from the private sector, let's say we draw 3% from the private sector each year. By the time 4 years have gone, close to 4% of GDP is gone from the economy. We're in a deep recession, and it's getting deeper and deeper every year because the government is taxing people to repay a debt that never has to be repaid through taxing. So, what is the progressive give-up formula that I'm talking about? It is the idea that we have huge debts that we cannot repay without taxing, without running smaller deficits, without running surpluses. And therefore, we have to negotiate with the Republicans intensely over issues like budget cuts to discretionary programs, tax cuts, whether or not we're going to run surpluses to repay the debt. The whole panoply of austerity arguments that we hear running around the political system every few years. That arises from the idea that we have to repay the debt instruments through taxing and through running surpluses. That's the basis for debt terrorism in our political system. And the progressives think, or many progressives, certainly Bree and Rick, share the idea that our debt, which is getting larger and larger, will eventually have to be repaid by us through higher taxation, through running budget surpluses, or through growth in the economy. But of course, if we're going to run budget surpluses, we're not going to have any growth in the economy. We get the growth in our economy through deficit spending. That's what it comes from. If Rick is worried about growing fast enough in order to pay off the debt, then that's going to depend on whether we can deficit spend or not. And he's implying we should not be deficit spending, because if we deficit spend, we incur more debt. He doesn't ever say that we can deficit spend without selling debt instruments, and that we could keep on deficit spending without selling any debt instruments at all if we wanted to. He doesn't seem to know about that. Bree doesn't seem to know about that. We could run deficits of 10% of GDP year after year after year and never tax enough to begin to wipe out any of those deficits or to curtail any of those deficits. In fact, we could stop issuing debt instruments to cover our deficit spending. It's very easy to do. In previous streams, I've outlined the methods we could use to do deficit spending without issuing any debt instruments while paying off the old debts. We could use overt congressional financing, or we could use the minting and issuing of platinum coins. Those two methods would allow us to deficit spend as much as we want without issuing any new debt. Okay, so there we are. That's my pitch for tonight. Now I want to turn to discussion and see what you guys thought. So sharing that and go back to the stream. Okay, so Dee, did you have any comments?
No, sometimes you wonder if they're being paid.
Huh? I'm sorry, say that again.
sometimes you wonder if they're being paid to sell the narrative that I guess some people in the government want you to think.
It may be the government wants you to think, but I certainly don't think that Bree Joy Gray and Rick Wolf are tools of the government. Okay,
You know, but yeah, because it doesn't make any sense unless they feel they want to be with the inside crowd, which makes no sense either. I mean, I just don't understand. They're both smart people.
okay. From my point of view, it's just a case of very smart people who are very busy, who learn that government financing happens in only one way, and they have refused to read about some new perspectives on how government financing occurs. They've had plenty of time to look at Stephanie Kelson's stuff.
Yes, they did, and they were right, like you said, they were right there with the people
They were
during the
right there.
campaigns.
They were right there with the people. MMT literature has been getting more and more and more prominent over the last 10 years or so. It's certainly being mentioned in the highest reaches of the government, perhaps not in a complimentary way, but people know it's there. Don't they have any obligation to learn the basics of what MMT is claiming? In other words,
And they have an audience. They have an audience. They have people that listen to them. You
yes,
would
but
think that they,
so how can they honestly approach their audience by saying the things they say without also saying that there is another school of thought out there how government financing occurs? And here's the basics of what they have to say. And we disagree with them. We don't think that's the way it happens because of this, and this. And so we are giving you this account of the debt ceiling crisis, which does not take account of MMT perspectives. Why do they feel free just to ignore MMT? Okay, now to be absolutely fair, in that interview at a later time, not too much later, what Bree said was uh, she leveled a question at Rick concerning what he has to say has to relate to solutions that are running around, uh, such as the MMT solution of the $1 trillion coin. So she knows the MMT solution of the $1 trillion coin is there, and she asks Rick about it. But somehow they never got to it in the interview. I mean, it's a rather direct solution to the debt ceiling crisis, and yet they never got around to discussing it.
I wonder if he didn't want to.
Hmm?
I wonder if he told her those are one of the things they're not going to discuss.
Those are
But he
one of
just,
the things. Those are one of the things that were not discussed in the interview. They never got to it.
okay, so I just know if he was saying that he didn't want to, because sometimes people will set an interview and say, I will not talk about this, this, and this.
No, he did not say he didn't want to.
Okay.
She just never got around to buttonholing him about it.
Okay.
He mentioned that she wanted to discuss this about minute 25 or something, or maybe minute 45. I think it was minute 45.
Okay.
Uh, okay, she mentioned how what he said would relate to a number of ideas that are running around, and she mentioned the $1 trillion coin, and then he started talking and giving his answers to that, but not to the $1 trillion coin. But she mentioned 3 or 4 or 5 things, and the $1 trillion coin, okay, was among them.
Okay.
He started talking about all the other things, and before he could get to the $1 trillion coin, I don't know if he would have gotten to it, or he decided to talk about all the other things so he wouldn't have to talk about the $1 trillion coin. But anyway, in the final analysis, they never got to the $1 trillion coin. And at the end of the video, she mentions
Okay.
that they have to get together and talk about some of these other things like the $1 trillion coin. Whether they will get together or won't get together, I don't know.
Right.
Okay, but the point is they let it slip. And it's a very direct solution to the problem of whether there is fiscal sustainability in the context of the debt or whether there isn't fiscal sustainability in the context.
Mhm.
I mean, Rick was operating on the theory that for there to be fiscal sustainability, the economy has to be growing so that you grow out of the debt. That's because of the famous case in the post World War II period. There was, of course, coming out of the war, very substantial debt, and people were worried about the fiscal sustainability of the United States. So the United States economy started growing so fast in the post-war period that in the next 20 to 25 years, we actually got the debt down to something like, I forget what it was, 28% of GDP or 30% of GDP. So no one was worried about it. I think that actually happened in Carter's time. Anyway, Carter was pretty close to the lowest percent of GDP figure in the post-war period. Okay, so there was a continual decline in the debt to GDP ratio from the end of World War II to the mid 1970s, okay, the mid to late 1970s. Then, with Reagan coming into office, the debt to GDP ratio started rising again very rapidly. Okay, so that's what was going on there. Okay, so I think it's just a case of people not learning stuff they should be paying attention to since they're claiming their authorities in a particular area. I've never really viewed Rick Wolff as much of an authority when it comes to macroeconomics. Okay, but I do know that some other so-called authorities, okay, in macroeconomics have the same view of government financing as Rick Wolff has. So I'm not saying that he didn't give a correct account because he's not really a macroeconomist. He's rather a labor economist, and his strong area is democracy at work. Okay, he's very good in that area. Okay, but he accepted an assignment from Bree to talk about an area of macroeconomics, okay, which was the debt and the debt ceiling crisis. So I have to say, I just don't think he was qualified to talk about that. So go on. Doc, we have a rally Sunday, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. for Medicare for All. Perhaps you can cover it. I think KK, I'm not sure what KK is. We have a rally Sunday, 11 a.m. to 1. Where's the rally going to be? Is it going to be here in D.C.? Okay, it's doubtful I can get to it. But if I can get a feed from it, then maybe that would be possible. Steve says, I think Kenneth Mejia will be there. He's monitoring police response to protesters, and the cops are really pissed off. What, they really pissed off at the idea they're going to have a protest? Okay, is this going to be in LA, Steve? Steve says, hi, Kay. Kay says, sounds good, Steve. Steve, what is the rally about? Well, it's about Medicare for All, I guess, right? Robert says, I heard of a Zoom call on the 15th for CalCare. And Steve says, the rally is about reintroducing the CalCare bill to our state Congress to get Medicare for All in California. 300 South Spring Street in Los Angeles. Pence got subpoenaed by the DOJ today. Smash the like button, says Steve. Already did that, says Kay. Robert, I hope somebody video covers the rally. Steve Wollenberg says, Doc, Kenneth Mejia is making news here, butting heads with Los Angeles Police Department and the mayor for monitoring their expenses. Check it out. Steve Wolfman says, Robert, perhaps I shall. Steve says, smash the like button. Steve Wolfman says, cut military spending, give the money to the people. Okay, again, from the MMT point of view, you can both give the money to the people and make the military spending. There's no fiscal reason why not. But, of course, we want to cut the military spending for other reasons. Specifically, we don't want to have a foreign policy that's based on military threats continuously, and bases all over the world. We don't want to have that foreign policy. That's why we should be cutting military spending. Robert Copeland says, how many people even know about MMT? An increasing number, especially in the circles that Rick Wolf and Bree Joy Gray run in. Many people know about MMT there. I mean, look, Status Quo is talking about MMT all the time because it has Steve Brumbine on. Kay Ryan says, oh, and certainly Bree Joy Gray knows about Status Quo, doesn't she? Kay Ryan says, I hear the wind out there now. Kay says, I do, Robert, but until the Fed does, we are stuck. Okay, guys, I'm out of here for tonight, says Kay. Love you all. We love you too, Kay. And Dia sent me a private. Oh, she says, be right back. Okay. That's what's in the private chat. So I'll go back to the comments. So I guess that about does it for me tonight, unless Dee has some last comments, which I'll ask her about when she gets right back. Honey, can you get me an aspirin? Thank you. Okay, and a turmeric pill too, please.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay, you're back. I think we're about ready to sign off.
Yes, I think so too. I think you did a really good job.
Do you have any final comments about it?
No, I think you really covered all the basics. I think you did a really good explanation
Thank
of
you.
presenting the fact against what they're saying. It just seems like they're stuck in time.
Yeah, it does seem like they're stuck in time. Okay, it really pisses me off. The reason why I wrote that book on the formula is because when the debt ceiling crises occurred and came to the fore, okay, what happened was, yes, it is okay to call Alana if you like. Okay, it was because the progressives, before the debt ceiling crisis, actually started to negotiate with the Austerians by producing programs that would reduce the deficit, but still give the money they wanted to give to the progressive programs. So they were producing programs that made the basic assumption that we had to be all about reducing the deficit because the debt was getting so large. So they were playing the same game as the Austerians.
Mm.
And that was so irritating because I knew the debt wasn't a problem. I knew the debt to GDP ratio wasn't a problem. That those things were never a problem for a monetary sovereign. And again, back then, like this was going on in 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. these so-called progressives, these people who are, just ignoring what MMT was putting out there. So I wrote a book about it. So I left you the link to the book. I left you all the link to the book. So yes, you can call Lana. As for other things, as for other considerations, we'll be back tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll be talking more about people who may be failing the litmus test. We'll find out tomorrow night whether 3 more members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus failed to pass the litmus test. I said that in kind of a backwards way. Whether they failed the litmus test. Okay, so folks, have a very good night, and we'll see you tomorrow.
And to remember to like, share, and subscribe to Joe's show.
And remember also to watch Around the World with Brandy and Dee, okay, at 8 p.m. And we also believe that Greg Mallard will be back tomorrow with the Revolution Evolution show at 10 p.m.
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, tomorrow on Around the World with Brandy and Dee, Joe and I are going to be discussing, and I think Greg's going to be on the show. We're going to be discussing the fallout and the geopolitical fallout from the truth coming out about the Nord Stream pipelines sabotage.
Yes, and we think that is going to be very exciting
Yes.
discussion. So we invite you to come to that discussion and stay on for what Greg is going to talk about, and also for the litmus test once again. So thanks a lot, folks, and we'll see you then.
Yes, thank you, and good night.
Good night.